So first of all, thank all of you for attending this talk at this very busy time. Also very importantly, I want to thank Professor Yawei Liu and Professor Hanchao Lu for helping organize this talk. Also very important, I want to thank Changdong Zhang, my friend from Peking University, for being able to give this talk, especially considering it's very early in the morning in Beijing right now. Dr. Changdong Zhang is Associate Professor of Political Science at the School of Government at Peking University. He received his PhD in Political Science from University of Washington, Seattle. Professor Zhang's research interests include taxation politics, fiscal sociology, state and society relationships, and institutionalism, with a particular focus on China and East Asia. His research has appeared in top journals such as China Quarterly, Politics and Society, Sociological Theory, so on and so forth. He also published a book entitled Governing and Ruling, The Political Logic of Taxation in China by University of Michigan Press. So I believe today's talk he's going to give is based on his newly published book. So I want to thank Changdong again for being able to give the talk. And Changdong, I think you have, let's say, about 1 hour to finish the talk. And we'll have 15 minutes to 20 minutes for Q&A. During your presentation, if attendees have questions, especially clarification questions, attendees should feel free to ask. Otherwise, you can type your question in the chat, maybe after the talk. But we'll see how to organize the Q&A later. But if you have any questions, you could type that in the chat, and I will monitor that. Okay. All right. Any questions from the audience? Okay. If not, may I suggest you to, turn your audio off so that we can hear the speaker more clearly. All right. Thank you all for cooperation. And Changdong, the screen is yours right now. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Wei Hua. Thank you for inviting me, and also thank Professor Liu and colleagues in the Center for China Studies for kindly hosting this event, and also thank all of the audiences. I'm very glad and also very honored to have this opportunity to share my research, my recently published book with you. So it's the title is Governing and Ruling, and the subtitle is The Political Logic of Taxation in China. And it used to be, the subtitle used to be Taxation and Authoritarian Resilience. But then at the last minute, I changed it to the current one because I'm afraid that the censorship may happen to me, and so I try to make it less sensitive. So the book actually has 8 chapters. So, and that's kind of like a long book. So today what I present here is kind of like a simplified version of this. And I also organize the presentation a little different from the chapter structures. Okay, so the big puzzle for the research is, so the general question is why some regimes could be sustained in some countries, but not in others, right? So this is a very classic question for comparative parties. And specifically, people are asking questions like why there's no democratization happens in China, right? And China is kind of like a very interesting, very interesting case because of that. First, it has experienced a market transition in the last 40 years. And for most other countries that has experienced market transition, not only the post-communist countries, but also some other authoritarian countries that had market transition, most of them have had democratization in the 1990s or later. And also market transition in China also brought very rapid economic growth in the last 40 years. And according to the modernization theory, high level of economic development will lead to democratization. And for me, I'm even more interested in another important transition, but it's kind of like neglected by many research. So that is the tax state transition. So I will elaborate what tax state transition is. So to summarize, it's under the perspective of democratization, China seems to be a very unique case. So for me, I tried, or under the literature of comparative authoritarianism, China seems to be kind of like a very an ideal case to study of authoritarian resilience. Okay, so what is authoritarian resilience or regime resilience? So we need to first distinguish regime survive from regime resilience. So regime survive is mostly a problem of maintaining power, but regime resilience is not only about survive, but it's also about thrive and adapt while fostering the growth of national military and economic power. Right? So it's kind of like resilience requires much more than survival. And to borrow the title of Stephen Koch, so he has a book like Ruling but Not Governing. So like what China or what the CCP has done in the last 40 years is not only about ruling, it's also about governing. And to borrow what Machiavelli said many years ago is the ruler should be loved and be feared at the same time. So be loved means governing. So you should provide good governance to be loved by the people. And also at the same time, you also do be feared by the ruled to hold the power. Okay, so for me, I try to kind of like contribute to the literature by bringing the taxation system into analysis. So I argue that the taxation system plays a very important role in resolving or alleviating the autocratic governance problems, therefore contributes to regime resilience through different mechanisms. Okay, so first, I very briefly introduce the theories and discuss with all of the theories. So I will start from the institutional turn of authoritarian resilience. So in the last less than 20 years, authoritarian resilience kind of like almost replaced the democratization paradigm as the most important paradigm studying in comparative parties. And in these literatures, people study different kinds of institutions, try to use these institutions to explain for authoritarian survival or resilience. Okay, so people would argue that repression is very, very important, right? So coercive and security institutions. And in the Chinese case, besides police, military, people also study the stability maintenance system, and also at the same time judiciary system. So there are lots of literature on this kind of institutions and how they contribute to the regime resilience. Scholars also study democratic-looking institutions like the legislature, election, and the party, right? Because they believe that these democratic-looking institutions play very important functions, mostly co-optation of the elites. People also study the electoral system, and in the Chinese context, it's about the KJ evaluation and management system. And people also study authoritarian welfare state, how the state provide welfares to co-opt. It's not only co-optation of the elites, it's also co-optation of the masses to buy their loyalty. And people also study propaganda, media, and internet censorship. Right? So there are emerging literature on this kind of topic in the last decade. So people study different kinds of institutions and believe that all of these institutions can contribute to regime resilience worldwide and also for China. But this kind of literature is with some limitations. Very importantly, all of these institutions, they have some paradoxes, or they are double-sided swords. At the one hand, they maybe help the regime or the ruler, but at the same time, there are some negative effects. So to study how these institutions contribute to regime resilience, we do need to examine both the positive and the negative effects. So for example, so when we're talking about social welfare, when the rulers use social welfare to buy the loyalty of the masses, it requires for money, right? So as Zhou Yongkang, the one of the standing committee member back to about 10 years ago, and who was in charge of the stability maintenance system, claimed that if a problem can be resolved by money, then this is a problem within the people, right? So 能用人民币解决的矛盾都是人民内部矛盾. So it's not about, it means people will not challenge the regime if they only care about money. But then the question is, where does the money come from? And there are, and for the institutional explanations, there are also some other critics. And for example, some people argue that the institutions are like the iron cages, but these iron cages, as Dan Slade argues, they can be simply manipulated by the ruler's iron fist. And some of them also adopt an overly simplistic view of how institutions work. So there are lots of there are some important review articles and annual review papers doing all of these criticisms. So I'm not going to elaborate all of this. And some of them are they are not in the endogenous endogenous explanations. So it's not there. In other words, there's no causal relationship between the institutions and the regime resilience result. So in this paper, I try to provide kind of like a better explanation. It's not by bringing taxation into analysis. Okay, so in most of the existing literature, taxation is taken as the dependent variable. But some scholars do take taxation as the independent variable to explain regime resilience. Okay, so in a paper by Slater and Fender, they argue that the taxation regime matters because it improves the state's infrastructural power, or in other words, the state capacity. And they provide the following four mechanisms. So basically, higher taxation capacity means higher infrastructural power, and then it contributes to authoritarian resilience. And people borrow insights from physical sociology theories, especially like Joseph Schumpeter and so on. So they tag that the taxation plays very important role for the state. And Max Weber also has very important insights on this topic. So this is what I try to build on. And so for me, I built on the existing literature on taxation. And then I proposed that infrastructural power is not enough to explain for authoritarian resilience, because for authoritarian regimes, the ruler, when they trying to improve their taxation capacity and their state capacity, they face these two very important dilemmas. The first dilemma is the growth dilemma. So growth dilemma means, I will elaborate a little later, means like if you want to tax more, then it may hurt economic growth, right? So there's a trade-off between economic growth and the revenue maximization. And the economic growth is the source, a very important source for the regime's performance legitimacy. The second dilemma is the representation dilemma. So it goes like the representation through taxation, right? So the growth dilemma is partially built on Douglas North's state theory. So there's always a trade-off between tax maximization and economic growth. And the state, according to North, could be both the solution and the problem of economic growth. So, but some scholars recently argue that for some countries, especially the OECD countries, they can do the tax maximization and economic growth at the same time, and they call this as the developmental cluster. So like they build a very complicated argument based on that. But most importantly, they argue that there should be some kind of representation mechanism to link the rulers and the ruled. Make sure the taxes will be spent on to provide either public services or social welfare. If we have a quick look at the recent data on economic growth records and the national tax growth rate, we will find that a very interesting trend. So we know that in the year of 1994, there was a very important tax reform. The tax share reform happened in China. So what we can see is before the tax share reform, what we can see is the nominal GDP growth rate was always higher than the national tax growth rate, right? But afterwards, the trend has been changed. What we find is the national tax growth rate exceeded the nominal GDP growth rate. Until very, very recently, when the Chinese government decided to cut off some taxes for the small and medium-sized enterprises. So there's kind of like an equilibrium. So if you tax too much, then it hurts the economic growth. And but if you tax too less, then the government will have some problems. Okay, so second dilemma borrows from Michael Mann's important distinction between the state's infrastructural power and despotic power, right? So the infrastructural power is the state capacity, and the despotic power is more about whether the state elite or the rulers can make decisions without consultation with civil society groups. So the Chinese government is regarded as a state with very high despotic power and very high infrastructural power. Right? So that's the but according to Michael Mann and some other researchers, if you want to improve your infrastructural power, you need to more cooperation from the society, and then it will reduce the despotic power. Right. So as Michael Mann puts it, when the state penetrates into the society also penetrates into the state. So there's like if you want taxation, if the state wants more taxes, then the society requires more representation. Right. So that's the representation dilemma. And also scholars develop some interesting theories to provide some micro foundation for this representation dilemma. So very importantly is the quasi-voluntary compliance theory. So basically it means the ruled or the citizens, they pay their taxes if they believe that the rulers will keep their bargaining and the other constituents will keep theirs. In other words, there should be some mechanisms of accountability between the rulers and the ruled. Okay, so I try to take China as an ideal case to examine how the improved taxation capacity contributes to the authoritarian regime while resolving these two important dilemmas, at least in the shorter term, but not necessarily in the long term. Okay, so there are three aspects of tax state. So the first is fiscal federalism. So fiscal federalism. So China is a unitary country. But many scholars believe that China has some kind of fiscal federalism. And in the book, I call it as de facto fiscal federalism because it's not a real federalism. And this also differs from the fiscal federalism by there's some communist legacy, especially the legacies of planned economy. In other words, nowadays, the Chinese local governments, they needed to meet some kind of tax target set by higher level government. Okay, so it's not a pure fiscal federalism. It's kind of like a combination of fiscal federalism and a planned economy. But in terms of transition, what we can say is that compared to the 1970s, China's today's fiscal system has a much higher degree of decentralization. The second dimension is what scholars call as half tax state. So tax state, like for example, the United States. The United States is a tax state because most of its fiscal revenue comes from taxes. But in China, as I will elaborate, what we find is only about 50 to 60% of the fiscal revenue come from tax. There's about another half or another 40% come from non-tax revenues. So this is what we call the half tax state. And compared to the 1970s, what we find is that at that time, China was not a tax state because under the planned economy, there was barely no taxes. The taxes played a very marginalized role for the country to collect this fiscal revenue. So there's transition, but this is like not a full transition, it's like a partial transition. And the third aspect of the tax state is tax administration. I will elaborate why I call this as under-institutionalized taxation system later. So there are three different dimensions of tax state. First is the central-local government relationship. The second is the sources of fiscal revenue. And the third is administration. So I will try to analyze how these three different aspects of the tax state resolve the two taxation dilemmas, the growth dilemma and the presentation dilemma. And to do that, I used a mixed methods research design. First, it is kind of like a case study. If we take China as a single case, but as we know, China is not a single case because Shanghai is very, very different from, say, like Guiyang, right? So it's kind of like a within case comparison. So my unit of analysis is county. So China has like about 3,000 county level units, right? So there are lots of cases, good enough to do some quantitative research. But first, I do an in-depth case study of one single county by doing process tracing. So which means like I went to the county, especially to do field work, and also I visited their archive, the county's archive center, and stayed there for like about a month. And I checked the many documents, archives, but they only allowed me to check the archives of the local People's Congress, not as the party's committee, not as the government's archives, because they thought that they are more sensitive. But still, I was lucky enough to got a very, very interesting data. So that's I will elaborate it later. And I also do some comparative case study. So it's kind of like I joined the supranational term in comparative politics. So by comparing different countries, so I use both method of agreement and method of difference, try to do the comparisons. And I also use some quantitative analysis to test the hypotheses I built up based on my comparative case studies. Okay, so now I will elaborate the first aspect of the tax state, which is the physical federalism or the de facto federalism. So I divide the history or the economic history of PRC, People's Republic of China, into three stages. The first stage is before the reform and opening up, or under the planned economy. At that time, what we had is planned economy plus a communist state. A communist state here is a very specific term. It's not like a general term. It's a definition provided by Ivan Lieberman, a professor in MIT, in his book comparing different kinds of tax states. So basically, what a communist state is, the state does not need to tax citizens because most of its revenues comes from the enterprises it directly earned, right? So the fiscal system is what we call as unitary remittance and unitary expenditure. In Chinese, it's 统收统支. So it means the central government got all of the revenue, and then it assigned the revenue to different units. So this is like unitary managed. And then in the 1980s and early 1990s, what we had, and as we know, a very important characteristic of the reform is decentralization, right? So decentralization led to partially liberalized market, very rapid development of township and village enterprises, and associated with that was kind of like a feudalized state, because in China at that time, we had the fiscal contracting system. And as we know, under the fiscal contracting system, each level of government signed a contract with higher level of government. And the contract will specify like how much revenue you needed to submit it to the higher level government. And then you can keep the rest or the most of the rest revenue with yourself. But you need to be responsible for the expenditure at the same time, right? So this actually looks like as some scholars would argue, like a feudalized state. It's not a modern state. And it's kind of like a modern tax farming because the higher level government took the lower level government as the tax farmers and so on. So at that time, there are also rampant actual budgetary fund. So the state, as I would elaborate, it's not like a modern state. And then after the tax shield reform, the Chinese Communist Party initiated a very comprehensive reform and they implemented it to try to build what we call a socialist market economy. It's not like a pure market economy, it's not a liberal market economy, but it's kind of like a market economy, right? Some scholars call this as the state capitalism. And associated with the socialist market economy is a half-tax state. So I will elaborate what a half-tax state is. But what we need to know now is that the government also tries to monitor the actual budgetary fund to have some kind of like unitary expenditure at the local level, not at each level of government, but not like as a nation, as a whole unit. Okay, so here, kind of like I just elaborated the points in the table here. So basically, under the fiscal contracting, what we have is the rising of township and village enterprises associated with feudalization or bureaucracy. And there was limited regional competition. And then under the tax share reform or under the tax share system, there was a wave of privatization of state-owned enterprises and collective enterprises. And there's rising regional competition. And the government changed the development strategy to investment recruitment. And associated with that is a rebuilding of the bureaucracy system. I call this as rebureaucratization. So I tried to engage with Yuan Yuan's a very famous book, which discusses the co-evolution of state and the market, and try to add some nuances to that. So here I get what we can see there. Here are two pictures here. So one is a picture of President Jiang Zemin, and he was talking about his legacies or his efforts to change China, right? As the title, a very famous book title says. And he was mentioning about that. Okay, so one of four important things I had done when I was the president was to cut off the relation, the military from doing business. So I stopped the military from doing business, and this is very important for the military. What he said, because then the military became more professionalized. Okay, so this is also very important for the government, because if the government do business, they run enterprises, then the government is cooperation, right? This is local state corporatism. They are not bureaucracy. And the second picture here is like an official document in Heilongjiang province, and it basically says that the officials should learn all of these media reports and then try to improve their business environment and stop. And what I want to emphasize here is to stop predating the businesses. Okay, so the government bureaus stop predating the business to improve the business environment. Well, so here again to borrow what Max Weber's definition of bureaucracy. Of course, as we know, Weber provides many characteristics for what a modern bureaucracy is. And here I will focus on the physical dimension of bureaucracy. Okay, so, and we find that at the different stage of economic development in China, the physical dimension of bureaucracy vary. Under the planned economy, and which has had the unitary remittance and unitary expenditure system, there was very limited revenue. But at the same time, all of the government officers, cadres, they were funded by physical revenue, right? But then in the 1980s and early 90s, under the fiscal contracting system, or the tax farming and actual budgetary funding system, what we find is that the government officers, they needed to raise money to feed themselves. Okay, they are responsible for their own salaries and expenditures. So this is what people call, it's kind of like a refeudalization. It's like a retreat from a modern state. And then after the tax sharing reform, the Chinese government also initiated many other fiscal reforms, including try to build budgetary management, provide more public services, and very importantly is to pay the tax officers' salaries and cut off the government bureaus from the business. So it's kind of like a very important effort to improve the modern bureaucracy. And there are also some other important changes like functional differentiation and also the personal requirement, especially whether there's an examination or not. So I tried to So when I went to the county, it's a county in Zhejiang province, and so it's kind of like relatively well developed. And according to President Xi Jinping, Zhejiang is kind of like leading China's development, right? Zhejiang is like 走在前列, it's like leading the development. It's kind of like a very important window, like to show how China is developed, right? So this is kind of like relatively well developed. But it's not like one of the top counties. It's not like one of the top 100 counties. It's not the 百强县. But what we can find is that in the last 40 years, on the one hand, we can see the change of the economy in terms of how the industry structure changed and the asset mobility improved. So, and then how the government changed the strategy of economic development. Because of the time limitation, I cannot elaborate it in very details. And then what we can see is also the private entrepreneurs, they improved their bargaining power to some degree. And associated with that is the patterns of bureaucracy or the model of bureaucracy. So what we find is under the fiscal contracting system, it's the bureaucracy is kind of like feudalism and patrimonialism. So if we follow Weber's definition terminologies, and then under the the tax share system, there's an emergence of modern bureaucracy, and it's thanks to the local government changed its development strategy and also the improved bargaining power from the capitalists. And here, maybe you will ask what the stage 3 here is. So it's kind of like I didn't discuss it in details in the book with only like one section here, but mostly I try to discuss how the rise of real estate industry kind of like wasn't the bureaucracy system bring more corruption, but still I think I needed more data to support the argument because the archive was not very open to me for the recent part for the very recent history. And based on that, I try to build try to revise Yuan Yuan's very important co-evolutional model by adding the physical dimension into the analysis. So what I argue here is that the Chinese economic reform started from physical decentralization, and then it led to a degeneralized bureaucracy system, as I just mentioned. But this was good for economic development to some degree, especially for the market to emerge. So at that time, we got SOEs, collective TVs, private TVs, but the different jurisdictions set very high trade barriers, and the government intervened very intensively. So this again generated some positive effects as well as negative effects. The positive effect is very rapid economic growth and rural industrialization. And the negative aspect, most importantly, was declining fiscal capacity for the government and especially for the central government. And therefore, the central government implemented the tax share reform in the year of 1994. And this led to the privatization, the wave of privatization. And as I just mentioned, the rising asset mobility. So now, because the socialist market economy was partially built, then there's some kind of asset mobility, especially for some regions with light industry and so on. And then the local government leaders, they changed their development strategy. So before that, their development strategy was to establish and run township and village enterprises. But now their strategy is not to run the enterprises by themselves. They wanted to attract more enterprises, attract more investment. So their strategy is to improve their business environment. And to improve their business environment, a very important part is to improve their quality of bureaucracy or the process of bureaucratization. Stop the government bureaus from predating the society or the business. And with a high quality of bureaucracy and the business environment, then there's the rise of mutual market. So it's kind of like here I added the physical dimension and also the physical dynamic into the analysis and try to improve the co-evolutional model. So based on the in-depth case study, I do some comparative case studies and try to compare with regions with high and low asset mobility and to identify whether there's a causal relationship between asset mobility and level of bureaucratization and then business environment. And I also try to find out the causal mechanisms under this relationship. So here are the two major cases I compared. So I'm not going to go to all of the details because I think I only have another 20 minutes or less. And I also have some complementary cases to do the comparison. And I needed to acknowledge that, so for my fieldwork, there are lots of limitations because taxation was and still is a very sensitive topic. And then I had a very, very hard time doing fieldwork, especially doing interviews with local government. So the complementary cases for them, I only collected part of the data, not full data. So they are kind of like complementary, not primary. And then I also discussed what theoretical implications. And I tried to use this co-evolution of bureaucratization and marketization to re-examine the three major theories of China's political economy of development, right? So the local state corporatism, the market preserving federalism, and also the adaptive informal institution theory by both introducing new evidences and new theoretical logics. Okay, now let's move to the second aspect of the tax state or the tax state transition. So as I mentioned, China now has a half tax state. So by half tax state, it means that the Chinese government relies very heavily on indirect taxes. So there are more than 60% of tax revenue comes from indirect taxes, especially the value-added tax. So this is very different from especially the United States, right? So the United States relies on direct taxes. And also very importantly is the state-owned enterprises. They played a very important role. They are important sources for fiscal revenue. So about 1/3 of the revenue were paid by state-owned enterprises. And in my book, I also identify specifically which kind of state-owned enterprises, especially they actually are the monopolized SOEs. And about half of the fiscal revenue come from non-tax revenue, right? So they very importantly is the Social Security Fund. So Social Security in some countries is regarded as taxes, but in China it's not taxes, it's a fund. But we also know a lot about the land-related revenue, like especially the land transfer fees, and there are different kinds of other fees, fines, and fundings. So all of this composes a half tax state, and this is very important in reducing citizens' tax perception, right? So this is what the art of plunking the gossips, right? So you need to tax as much as possible. At the same time, you don't want the citizens to realize that they are taxed very, very heavily. And we also did a survey in 2014. And we asked the respondents. So the respondents are the urban residents in Chinese, the prefecture level cities. So what we find is that for whether they regard as their tax burdens as fair compared to the peer groups or like their friends, neighbors, most of people have no idea about tax fairness because they don't know how much taxes they paid, and only 6.8% of people think they paid too much. Their tax burdens are too high, right? But at the same time, they are 15% of people think that they are fair. Even 2% of people think they are too low. So it's kind of like very, very interesting. People have very low perception of the tax burdens. And this is about their tax perception compared to public services they received. So a little more people think they paid too much taxes compared to the public service they receive. But also more people believe that it's fair. So it's kind of like people, because of the half tax state, people don't perceive their very heavy tax burdens. So therefore, the state has very strong state autonomy. It doesn't need to demand for negotiation with the society to tax people, right? Therefore, if people have low tax consciousness, then they will not demand for representation. So, in other words, the Chinese government can significantly improve its taxation capacity and therefore its infrastructural power without lose or weaken its despotic power, right? So that's kind of like how the dilemma is resolved. But at the same time, it's not a free run. It's not a free lunch, right? There are also some negative effects, especially negative effects for further economic development. SOEs are inefficient, and indirect taxes, land revenue, they generated very, very high inequality, especially income and also wealth inequality among citizens. Corruption and land revenue also leads to lower asset mobility, rising social riots, and very high housing prices. All of these are bad for further economic development. So in other words, half tax state, on the one hand, helps the government to resolve the representation dilemma at the cost of the growth dilemma, right? So there's kind of like a trade-off. Okay, now the third dimension of tax state, and it's the under-institutionalized tax administration. Okay, so if we just look into, if we have a very quick examination of representation through taxation, what we find is that there are more and more private entrepreneurs are becoming deputies of People's Congress at a different level, and also People's Political Consultative Committee conferences, and even at a certain local level, some of them even become members of the party's committee. Okay, so it's kind of like there is representation through taxation happens, right? Because the more taxes you pay, the more likely that you will be a representative. I mean, either in the People's Congress, which is the legislature, or the People's Political Consultative Conference, or even the party's committee. Right. So in every March, we can see at the National People's Congress, we can see that deputies, and many of them are actually private entrepreneurs. And Hou Yue at UPenn published a book, The Private Sector in Public Office, right? So, and she studies how the private entrepreneurs, what they do in the different levels of People's Congress. But if we look into the back, and what we examine why they want to be a representative and how they get to be a representative, what we find is that they care more about the patron-clientelism relationship rather than be co-opted or to do representations. So why is that? A very important reason is the under-institutionalized taxation system. Of course, this is only one part of a more general or non-rule of law system, right? But the under-institutionalized taxation is very, very important for the private enterprises. So here I define the under-institutionalized taxation system as, first, it's an institution that sets very high nominal tax rates. So the Chinese government sets very high nominal tax rates and plus other fines and fees. Most Chinese enterprises, especially the private enterprises, they are unable to pay this nominal tax rate. So in my field work, all of the private entrepreneurs and even some tax officers admitted that if the enterprises pay this tax rate, none of them will make any kind of profit. Okay, so and the government has and the private entrepreneurs have very limited opportunity to reduce the nominal tax rate, because even if they are the National People's Congress deputies, they barely have no say on whether or not to change the tax rate, because the legislature has very limited power here. Because of the nominal tax rate is very, very high, then the tax officers, they have very high discretional power, because they know the enterprises cannot pay this kind of tax rates, but so therefore they can decide how much they pay. And also they collect taxes based on tax targets rather than the taxpayers' tax liabilities. Okay, so last year, so Premier Li Keqiang announced that, okay, so this year the central government will not set the target for GDP growth, annual growth rate, and we are not going to set the target for tax revenue growth rate, right? So, but still for the lower level government, they said this kind of target. Otherwise, it's difficult for them to monitor whether the lower level government and the tax bureaus are doing their jobs. So, as I mentioned, this is the legacy of the planned economy, but all of this kind of hurts the rule of law system, right? And the implication for the capitalists is that there's very, very rampant tax evasion, and in the recent years, what we have learned is that some the movie stars like Fan Bingbing and some people like that, they were charged for tax evasion, and then they were badly punished, very badly punished, right? And then everybody are criminals. But the government will not punish everybody. They only selectively implement the policy, right? And also they selectively punish some of these criminals. And some people regard this as kind of some legal reparation. So it's legal because you violated the law, but it's kind of like a regulation because everybody is violating the law. Why punish me? And therefore, there's some kind of institutionally generated fear among people, especially the private entrepreneurs. And therefore, they want to build some kind of patronage, a relationship with the party government officers. So according to Machiavelli, what he said, okay, it's difficult for the ruler to be loved, but at the same time be feared. Then it's better to be feared than be loved, right? So it's very important to generate all of this fear. And for this legal repression, it's kind of like generating some kind of compliance, and it's kind of co-optation via deterrence. If we call the legislature co-optation is the co-optation via privilege, then legal repression is the co-optation via deterrence. And privilege make people love you, and the deterrence make people fear you, right? And so I developed this theory more systematically in a paper published in the Politics and Society in 3 years ago. But so I don't elaborate it in very details in the book. Okay, to conclude, so in this book, by analyzing the tax state transition, and especially these three different aspects of tax state transition, and how it linked to the governing and ruling. I try to provide an endogenous institutional explanation of authoritarian resilience. And I also try to argue that legal reparation is kind of like a pattern of domination. So while the methods of domination have changed, the nature of domination has not been changed in the last 40 years. And I also did some comparisons, both historical comparison and compare with some post-communist countries and other developing countries, try to test kind of like the external validity of my argument. And I summarize this very complicated argument in this figure, but it kind of like I simplified the analysis in this presentation, so I did not introduce the social control agent discipline and the cooperation, the definitions here, but basically this is how the logic goes in the book. So thanks for your attention, and your comments, suggestions, critiques are highly appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. I think we should first give a round of applause to this great presentation. Thank you. So I think Dr. Zhang gave a very, macro overview of the fiscal system in China. Of course, due to time concern, he cannot go to the details of the case studies he has done. But the email is on the screen, so you could get in touch with him on any aspect of this research. But other than that, I wonder if the audience have any questions. You can raise your hand, and if I see you, I will call your name. Okay, maybe you guys can still think about your questions. I can use my privilege of being the moderator to ask a question. So like, do you have any guesstimate, like a guess on how the half tax state system will evolve? Do you think it will evolve into like a full tax state, or will stay as it is? Like what's the trajectory, right? So is this good enough for the governance already? Because you can argue that there are rising demands from the citizens on public service, and the local government are running out of money, right? Based on all the news we have read. So I think there must be some massive changes to this system. That's a broad question. Yeah, I want to hear your view on that.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so actually this is the question I had in my mind for a long time, and it's very, very important part of. So I think how the half tax state will evolve. Actually, it's not one single question. It's like it has many sub questions. So, for example, one is for example the role of state-owned enterprises, right? So, as I mentioned, the SOEs paid about 1/3 of the revenue, the tax revenue, and very recently is the People's Bank, so the central bank of China, actually paid how much, like a trillion, a trillion, or how much, like a very, very significant number of money to the Ministry of Finance. And the money can actually come from its profits for in the last 3 years. as part of the revenue. So for the role of SOE in the tax state, what I can say is that under the for the party leaders, they believe that SOEs are very, very important, and they want to further improve the SOE's role, right, in both in the economy and therefore maybe also in the physical side. For the land, more and more people believe that the land transfer fee and the land revenue is declining. I mean, not necessarily in the short term, but in the long term, it will decline, right? So therefore, because urbanization in China is kind of like, there's too much urbanization. And therefore, the value of land will decrease. And also, high land price already generated the whole property price problem. So therefore, land is not sustainable. And for the indirect taxes. So what we find is that it's very interesting. So on the one hand, the central government and also like the ministers of the Ministry of Finance, they, in many different occasions, they claimed that the Chinese government will try to switch from a system that largely rely on indirect taxes to rely on direct taxes. But at the same time, all of the reforms in the last 10 years, most of the reforms in the last 10 years, actually it's kind of like transfer some of the direct taxes into indirect taxes. So one very famous case is the 营改增. So it's like the 营业税. So the business taxes were transferred into value-added taxes. So it's direct taxes changed into indirect taxes. So it's kind of like they are saying we are going to the left, but they are actually they go the right. So, but at the same time, there are also some positive evidences. So one is the individual income tax. So the individual income tax is getting more and more important, and now it's like composes more than 7% of the national tax revenue. I mean, it's compared to the United States, much lower, but it's important. And citizens are required to calculate their tax, to self-report their individual income. So this kind of like raises their tax perception. And at the same time, the party is very hesitating to introduce the property taxes or the real estate taxes. So the government had made an announcement more than 10 years ago that we were going to collect property taxes, but it has been postponed for many times because it is a direct taxes, and people care about and how we perceive their burden once it is their houses or apartments are taxed. So yeah, so I think in general, the half tax state will not be changed very significantly, but a part of it will be changed. And they may, so I'm looking forward to it and see whether, especially the introduction of property taxes will change local governance, especially lead to more local representation at the local level, for example, the county level, but not necessarily to the national level. Thank you.
I think that's great, especially your point about the property rights, property tax. I think that's going to be a big part. So that means the government still have some ideas, legitimate ideas or means to collect revenue, right? So that's a big part, yeah. So here's a question in the chat. I'm going to read it to you, to the audience.
Okay.
So how can the ordinary citizens within China raise their consciousness of taxation at the current stage? Because the government is trying to undermine this consciousness of taxation on the part of the citizen.
Okay, yeah, so this is a very important question. And actually, I have written a paper with Bruce Dickinson. And very unfortunately, the paper was, we received a desk rejection just 2 days ago. And so in the paper, we tried to answer the question, and especially why. So here, if we, in the slides, we try to explain why Chinese urban citizens have very, very low perception of their tax burdens. So in the paper, we use different kind of like institutions to explain for why there's low perception, or especially we go a step further to explain why some people perceive it as fair, some people perceive it as unfair, and some other people have no idea about their tax perception. So what we find is that on the one hand, the half tax state in general reduces people's perception of their tax burdens, right? So this is constant. And then we go a step further, and we try to study whether people's reception of welfare will influence their tax perception, especially their fairness perception compared to the public services received. And we find there's it's significant. And then we also studies whether the propaganda or whether people's consumption of different information sources. So whether they watch CCTV as their major source of information, or whether they rely on internet or commercial newspapers and so on. And we find that different sources of information have some influence on their perception. Okay, because the official media what the official media tell people is that okay, it's honorable. It's an honor. It's honorable to pay taxes. If you are a good citizen, you pay taxes. We collect taxes because we want to provide better public services. So that's the official propaganda. But what we find in the commercial media and also the Sina Weibo and Weixin, what we find is that it's more about okay, so Chinese people's tax burden are too high, it's miserable, and so on. So different sources of information provide kind of like different propaganda or information on tax burdens. So people's tax perception, and especially their fairness perception, are deeply influenced by these three different institutions. So yeah, thank you.
Right. All right, Han Tao, please ask your question. Yeah.
First of all, Dr. Johnson, thank you for a great presentation. I think in your presentation you mentioned that in 2018 there was a reform in which the state taxation merged with local taxation. Is that a re-centralization or decentralization?
It's a re-centralization.
So
yeah,
does this suggest that China is actually at a stage in which it's re-centralizing the whole taxation?
Yes. So. But it's still, because it happened only like a few years ago, so it's still something in progress. And so what? Okay, so associated with this, the merge of state taxation system and the local bureaucracy, Bureau of Taxation was another important reform. So which is like for the Social Security Fund. So in about like 16 Chinese provinces, the Social Security Fund was used to be collected by the Bureau of Social Security and the Human Resources, but not the taxation bureaus. But then, after the merge of SAT and LBT, the central government decided that the new SAT, the new state administration of tax, are going to charge or in charge of this Social Security Fund in and then because the taxation system, the taxation bureaus, they are much more capable in collecting taxes and fees. Many private enterprises actually, they complained that they are unable to pay all of the social security fund. And then, so what happened in 2018 and 2019 was that many private enterprises complained, and there's like a fiscal scholar who called the tax rate. I mean, it's a generally defined tax rate. It's tax, fees, fines, and so on. All of the enterprise burdens, and he called this as the death tax rate, like a 死亡税率. So it's kind of like, so it means that, okay, so if the high tax rate is driving the enterprises to death, right? And then also some very famous private entrepreneurs also complained for that. So for example, Zhong Qinghou, the president of Wahaha, and also Fuyao, the Fuyao Corporation, I mean the guy who built an enterprises in the United States. So all of these guys, they complained that, okay, so we are unable to pay the taxes. I would rather move my factory to the United States rather than in China, because the cost is lower in the United States, right? So, and then the Chinese government decided to, on the one hand, not to collect all of the social security fund required by the law. But at the same time, it also had the tax reduction and so on. So that's the change. So I think the goal was to decentralize the taxation power, but at the same time, especially the year of 2018 coincided with economic slowdown, right? So therefore, there's more resistance to the reform. So did I answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? It could be on the fiscal system, could also be on the tax, including tax, could be on other aspects of the state governing and ruling, right? Because Chandong is expert on this topic, not just on the tax aspect, but from the overall. Right.
So, Professor Zhang, thanks for your fantastic presentation. So, away from taxation, as Wei Hua just mentioned, you're expert not just on taxes, but also on governance as well as ruling. So, from your research, in terms of the prospect of political reform, you made the argument in your presentation that the Chinese state, has a lot of tools in the toolbox to impose more taxes, and the people themselves are not going to feel miserable, upset. Does that mean that the leaders do not really have to care about political reform? Not only because the Chinese citizens are not aware of taxation representation issue, but also because the state can do so much without hurting the people. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, this is a good. This is a great question. Actually, so in the because I didn't get enough time to go to the details for my conclusion, and so actually so in the conclusion chapter, actually I cited Deng Xiaoping's very famous discussion on the relationship between political reform and economic reform, right? So Deng Xiaoping argued that without further political reform, the economic reform is unsustainable, and the achievements of the economic reform maybe even will be loosened, right? So that's the so actually I did try to engage with this question. So and for me, then I also try to engage with North and Vanguard's argument on their open access order, like whether but currently China doesn't have this open access order, and then from the perspective of taxation, I try to examine whether it's possible for China to transit into this open access order, and how the current taxation system actually stopped, or not, if not stopped, in the long term, how it kind of resist this transition. Yeah, so actually, so for me personally, I think some kind of political reform, I mean, maybe not necessarily democratization, but some reform, especially accountability mechanisms at the local level, and some other reforms are very, very important to improve the situation. Yeah, so I agree with you that political reform are very important, and for the counters, and for the tax, I also discussed that it's better for the central government to reduce the nominal tax rates, and also to make because nowadays most of the taxes are not they are not tax laws, they are by regulations, like they are 条例, not 法律, right? So it's kind of like the level of legislation is also very low. So it's important to change the bylaws to law. So, and therefore the National People's Congress should play a more important role and set more reasonable tax rates. And then for the lower level People's Congress, there should be more representation and a more accountability system. So I think you're right. So without further political reform, it's difficult to sustain the current system. And in the conclusion, I also try to discuss the relationship between the growth dilemma and the representation dilemma. And I argue that it's very likely that in the long term, there's no two dilemmas, there's only one dilemma. So I think you are right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. I think we can have one more question, at the most two, but I'm thinking one may be fair because we're getting to 9:30. Yeah. Anyone? Maybe I can just ask a quick one. If you have a, audience, if you have another one, you can think about that. Because I'm thinking, just based on your research, you talk about all this revenues, taxation coming into the government. Do you see any rising demands on the spending part, right? The local government, different government will face different demands. Some local government are poorer than others. There's a lot of regional inequality. But, if you look at the Chinese history, like the dynasties, right? All these dynasties are doing well physically until a point that maybe social rights, whatever happened, right? Take a lot of spending from the government. And then the balance between revenue, spending was kind of, disturbed. And then the dynasty kind of fall into a downward path. So I just want to ask, do you have any kind of idea or thinking on the spending part, like the most demanding spending for the government?
Yes, so this is a good question. And in the last few years, I was criticized for not considering the expenditure side in my research. But I think it's very important. But for the book, I needed to concentrate on the income side. Yeah, so this actually, so I remember that it was like 9 years ago when I did presentation or a very early draft of the book manuscript in the school. So Professor Li Qiang, now he's retired. So he asked me the question that, okay, so this is very, very interesting, because what we think is the fiscal revenue cannot keeping growing in the forever, right? And but at the same time, the expenditure keeps growing, right? So he asked that, okay, so what will happen if especially to the local level, if the local government suddenly lose their fiscal revenue, what will happen? And he thought that it will be a very good opportunity for the local governments to introduce some kind of local democratic practices. But so far, I mean, I think you are right. In many local governments nowadays, they are facing very serious fiscal problems. So it was reported that some county level governments, they are even unable to organize this free COVID or Omicron test for all of the citizens. So the higher level government asked them to do this test because they want to make sure it's there's a zero infection. But the local government, some local governments, they are too poor to pay for that. Okay, so and even the very rich province like Guangdong province, the teachers in public schools and the government officers, their salaries were significantly reduced in the last year, right? So so I think we will see how things will change in the coming years. So on the one hand, there's the Omicron is still influencing the economy, especially given the central government's very, very strict policy in controlling the disease at the cost of economic growth. And then, and therefore it will lead to, of course, the physical declining. Yeah, so I think, but we should wait and see. But this is actually a very, very important point and a very good question we need to answer in the coming years.
Professor Zhang, I have a very quick question. This is an academic book. You think it can be translated and published in China without any censorship?
It's impossible.
No?
No, it's impossible.
Okay, thank you.
And Chandong prefer publishing in English. So, yeah.
But publishing it in English won't bring any problem to you, right? Even though it cannot be translated into Chinese.
Possibly it will, but so far I'm fine.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Okay, so I think on behalf of all the attendees, I'm going to give another round of applause to our speaker. Yeah. Thank you so much, Chandong. This is a great research. And I know you're going to write a second book following, as a follow-up to this project. So good luck with that. And I thank you for your time. And we should keep in touch. For the audience, if you have any question on Chinese, government, governance, related questions, I think Professor Chandong Zhang can be found at the email address he showed before. Okay. Once again, thank all of you for joining the meeting. Let's keep in touch. Thank you, Professor Liu, for making this happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Thank you, Wei Hua, and thank you, Professor Liu. Thank you for everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.